Hello and welcome to Turning Point Tactics, the competitive Kill Team 40k podcast, focused on giving you the strategies and tactics to seize initiative every turning point. I'm your host Ryan, and I'm joined by the Gawk to my Mork, Connor. How you doing this evening, Connor?
I'm good, thanks, Ryan. Today's episode is about the attacker-defender roll-off. I'm going to put my hand up here and say that I'm the first to just choose attacker every single time, but I understand that you put quite a lot of thought into that attacker-defender decision. Did you want to discuss those thoughts a little bit?
Absolutely, because I think it's actually part of the game which is so often just glossed over. You know, people just turn up to the board and they just go, I'm on this side of the board, I'll stay where I'm sat. And I think that really misses potentially quite a bit of nuance when you're using particularly asymmetric board layouts. So I think the first question that you have to address or think about when you're doing this attacker-defender decision is there a drop zone on that board that you absolutely have to avoid? So is there a drop zone with such little sparse cover that you can't get all the models that you need onto that drop zone? Or potentially, is there a drop zone that the opponent absolutely cannot have? And an example that I would give is, particularly as we're looking into this new scouting phase, dashes and change of orders and all that sort of stuff, and new competitive changes. But it's like vantage points inside the deployment zone. Against Vet Guard, that can be a real problem to deal with them being able to use entrenching tools to set up there and not be able to be shifted. So it might be that you look at the board and you don't personally really care too much about whether or not you have side A or side B, but maybe you know that the opponent really, really wants side A, and by denying them that side, you can have a much better advantage. I've had this happen a few times during competitive games, particularly when I got to Warhammer World and ended up playing my teammate Mark, and I looked at the map and I just thought, if I really want to be attacker, because being able to guarantee initiative, or not guarantee initiative, but increase my odds of initiative turn 2 would be pretty helpful. But in this particular scenario, based on the terrain disposition, I know that I'm almost onto a guaranteed loss if I get that other side of the board. So I have to choose defender, and I have to choose this side. And I think that's a really important thing for people to be able to think about.
I think I knew that from like a basic level, the idea of like, I should, if I am defender, I should choose the side that most benefits me and protects me. But you've opened my eyes a little bit there by saying, is there a side that's absolutely horrendous for my opponent? And that's changed my idea about the defender role, actually, because the idea that you could force Vet Guard or Pathfinders to bunch up and almost prep yourself for a turn 1 blast strike is a really interesting idea.
Yeah, and we'll go into a bit more detail about, when you're making that decision between which side is which, what to think about. But there is a few other things that I think is quite useful when you're making that decision. So if we start with from the mindset of you want to be the attacker, or reasons why you want to be the attacker, and one of them is potentially that you're looking for a specific model matchup. Now this is going to change slightly because obviously they're changing the way that deployment's happening, so we're now deploying in thirds, vice deploying your entire team. But the principle still, is the same. There might be a particular model that you really want to be able to position around. So maybe you want to position, in the case of the Pathfinders, your Transpectral to be able to apply -1 APL to the Vet Guard spotter from a safe position, potentially. That's just one example. Or maybe, it's to avoid the Commander Dynamite as another example. But whatever it is, there is a specific model matchup that you're trying to achieve, and by doing so, you're going to change the state of the game. So that might be something to consider. One thing I would just put on a little bit of caution there is just be aware about teams that potentially have the ability to redeploy. So Phobos can reset up operatives and that sort of stuff. So if you're not aware of it, like, be careful that your opponent doesn't have an ability to be able to change that model matchup and sort of ruin your game plan. The other thing that you can think about as well is potentially ploys that allow people to forward deploy. So I mentioned it or touched on the case of the commander already. They can't be deployed within 6 inches of other operatives. Now, potentially by throwing out, say, your own forward deployed model, or by positioning your models in such a way, there might be a bit of terrain or cover or whatever it is that they would really want to try and use, and by deploying first, you can put a model in that area and immediately stop them from being able to do that, and that might force their forward deploy really far back. So that's a potentially another thing that I would say is a consideration for being an attacker. But probably the most common is going to be the play for initiative turn 2. We've all had it. Turn 2 is so critical for who wins or loses the initiative. And it often begins with the trading game right there and then. So the difference is only a little bit in percentages, but if you win on draws, i.e. you force your opponent to go first, turn 1, which you can do through a scouting step, you can play for that turn to initiative, which is a 58% to 42% chance. Not a huge difference, but I'm sure you've had enough games where you think, guy, I just wish on this turn, on turn 2, I had initiative, and it might be that that small 16% swing that's going to put it in your favour.
Yeah, I think I often will deliberately give my opponent turn 1 if I win that roll off and I'm choosing about it, and so we've matched up or whatever, I've got the advantage. I will give my opponent turn 1 thinking that I've hopefully deployed correctly. There isn't any alpha strikes, and I'm looking to get that initiative turn 2, or even maybe force my opponent to move a model, which will then open up something for me to react to, something like that. We both deployed in a way there's no alpha strikes. Well, that's pretty unconstructive. However, once he's moved, that's now created something that we can try and work around. Maybe I can use a model to try and see him. If I'm playing Pathfinders, which I typically do, maybe I can start building marker lights on him to try and remove obscurity on that model. Those sort of ideas.
Yeah, and that's another thing as well to consider. So potentially, in that initial selection, you have to consider what your opponent can do. So I've mentioned the Commando. You just touched on marker lights there, and their ability as well. So that's something to consider, and make sure that you don't give them the opportunity to be able to use and abuse their own abilities on turn 1 potentially, or in a way that you don't want them to. I guess the next thing that we can sort of touch on, what's the thought process behind choosing a board side? Now, it might be that you didn't get to choose attacker defender, or it might be that you've decided that that's the one that you want to do. So there's a checklist or a thought process that I go through in my head. I think it might be useful for some people to be able to see, okay, if you use the same sort of checklist, then maybe you can get a better board side more frequently. So the first thing that I'm going to look at when I get to a board is, like, what does your actual deployment zone, drop zone look like? Is there enough heavy cover to hide your models behind, or would they be exposed? Is the light cover that's in your drop zone, is it protected by some obscuring terrain from their vantages, and therefore is that going to be safe to use, or is it actually just a dead zone that's going to potentially get you caught out? And then how easy is it going to be to then go from that cover where you currently are to then plan ahead your next move? So a really common thing is, like, let's say Vet Guard. Vet Guard have that pre-game 3-inch dash. So potentially, if all your heavy cover is just 3 inches in front of you, that's not an issue for Vet Guard, because they can sit everyone in the open, but before any shots are fired, boom, all those guys are now in a safe place ready to move forwards, and that can be really huge. So that's the first thing, is there enough space to keep all of my guys safe? That's probably where I'd make my first point. Any thoughts on that, Conor?
Well, just as you were touching on it there, you mentioned moving forward, and something that just caught my eye. We thought a lot, quite deliberately, about deployment in the deployment zone. Do you ever think about what's going to happen in turn 2, and think about where I can move my models to, and the access and ability to get to those positions from each side? Is that a decision that you sort of goes through your mind?
That is 100% a decision that's going to mind as well. And it might be that you're trying to plan a route for, let's say, your Grenadier model to get into a good position to be able to do the strikes that you want, or potentially to be able to get your charging models, your melee models, into positions where they can get effective charges off as well. And I think that's something you have to consider. And if you're primarily a shooting team, the next thing you're going to need to look at is, what are your shooting angles? What is your shooting lanes? And how are you going to get access to vantage point if you need it, or other means? So it might be that you can, you've got loads of heavy cover, but it's all able to be seen through, and then you're playing against someone that has the ability to ignore obscurity quite easily. Let's say either Phobos or Pathfinders, or a team like that. Now, as soon as you sort of see that, you think to yourself, okay, right, I can get all my guys safe, but I can't actually do anything with them. Like there's nowhere for them to go that's then going to potentially open up those threats that I need to keep my opponent honest throughout the course of the game. So that's the next thing that I would look at. And building on from that as well, you mentioned thinking about turning point 2. Well, you need to also think about your route to tac ops, and we'll go into more detail in that in future episodes. But it's not just about, okay, how do I start safe? That's one point. But then it's, okay, how am I going to get to a position in the mid board where I can start scoring VP? That's the next point. And then how can I then make sure I have credible threats in positions up the board, which is then going to potentially deny my opponent being able to score their VP? And that sort of thought process as you go through is going to be really, really important, I think.
Yeah, I think every team has some sort of, well, every tac op set has some mission objective where you're trying to get into the opponent's deployment zone at some point, and then trying to plan that route there with safety. I think if you get that wrong in the deployment zone, you're never going to make it. Should factor into your decision making.
Yeah, 100%. I think as well. So, if we look at old tac ops, because I guess that's what most of my experience has been, but it's going to read true across to new tac ops as well. But if you look at like the example of plant signal beacon, you need to start thinking about plant signal beacon from, ideally, like the latest is turn 3, but you really want to be thinking about it from turn 2, and if you can, turn 1. And you need to think, who are the models that I'm looking to be moving up the board into a position to be able to score that. And so I played a lot of Pathfinders, and therefore I know that it's like, okay, right, sure, I can use recon sweeps and I can use all this sort of stuff to be able to get the model there, but at the end of the day, it's still a 2 APL action, and I still need to have at turning point 4 or sooner one of my guys within 6 of their deployment zone. Otherwise, it's not going to work, and that's going to cost me 2 VP, which is obviously a pretty significant penalty. So I just talked then about looking at it from your side of the board. So you're there thinking, okay, I really want to be able to do X, Y, and Z to be able to achieve my own tac op goals. But if we flip it round, let's say the board is agnostic to you. You're playing security, and you're happy with the terrain layout, whatever else, and you're not going for siege ground, whatever it is, fine, you don't care. But your opponent, let's say, is playing Corsairs, and maybe on one side of the board there's 2 very easy vantage points for them to be able to get to, and either secure vantage or do the vantage action as per the old tac ops, whichever one it's going to be. And maybe on the other side of the board there's only one, so that for them to achieve their own tac op, they're going to have to go a significant further distance. That's going to be really important to be able to make them have to work significantly harder to achieve their own VP. And that's I think, quite a good point to be able to think about as well.
It comes into know your enemy, doesn't it? You can know your own team and get a good idea, but just what you're saying there, if you can know what the enemy's trying to do as well, that's when you can really start to control the game, control the board. I've got a question though. We've discussed asymmetry quite a lot, but Into the Dark is actually a very symmetrical board. Do a lot of these ideas still apply to Into the Dark?
I think so. I think there's still there is still some differences in Into the Dark. I agree with you though that it is probably a 90%, 10% you want to be taking attacker Into the Dark. But occasionally on some of the maps, it might be that your ability to place a barricade first, because it denies an area of barricade within 2 inches of it, might be really important. So it might be that you can deny your opponent a certain channel of movement, or it might be that you can deny them access to cover on a objective in a way that you want to have it. or it might be that you're making sure that you can place your barricade in a way that protects you in exactly the right place. So I still think there's an element of thought to it there, but I agree with you because the map itself is so symmetrical as such. It's, there isn't a huge change there, and I really want to have that vantage point, or I really want to be in close proximity to that objective. So there's not at that same level, but there's still some thoughts, considerations into it, which means it's not 100% attacker every time, but probably 90% for Into the Dark.
Not an immediate, but definitely strong.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we also had a podcast first, which is a question from the audience. So I think these are a really great thing for us because it helps gauge where we are with the podcast, if we explain things clearly or not, if we need to recover certain areas and that sort of thing. So we fully encourage people to get in with more questions, and hopefully we'll answer them as the podcast grows and continues. And we'll try and make this a weekly thing. But do you want to go ahead with our first audience question, Conor?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Ryan. So as a mid-level player, I often find myself playing some of the monsters of the UK scene, where you can be heavily punished for some small mistakes. What are the best ways of removing those from your game, and also avoiding going on tilt?
So I think it's a fantastic question. It's kind of got two parts to it. And actually it ties in quite nicely with what we've been talking about here initially, and when we go in to talk about deployment in a later episode into that as well. And then finally it sort of talks about tilt, or being triggered, or losing your cool during a game, which is another great point. So I think we'll start with the how can you avoid small mistakes. I think there's no way to 100% avoid small mistakes, but you want to make sure that the punishment that you receive from them is less than a game-ending punishment potentially. So I think the crux of this usually is coming down to deployment, and it might be that you've made a bad board selection, as in which board side that you're on, or it might be that you're deploying models incorrectly. So the number one way to avoid a turn one alpha strike that's going to really ruin your day, which then becomes heavily punishing from what seems like a very small deployment mistake, is going to be deployment, and it's going to be your board selection. So use of heavy cover, turning point 1, is your friend, and you will see the difference as you go through between a new player to the game and a more experienced player. So a more experienced player is mostly operating on conceal, and the majority of their operatives are moving between heavy cover and turning point 1, or they're using obscurity to be able to make sure that the light cover they're in is safe from vantage points, or safe from those sort of angles. And it's something that I come down to when I think about even the placement of my barricades, is I get that laser pointer out straight away, draw a laser line, and think, is where I'm placing this barricade going to be obscured from that vantage point, or is it going to be in full line of sight, and am I just going to put a model that's going to be shot there straight away? And if I am, I need to activate them and move them before they die, as my first activation, or I accept that they're a casualty, and I'm going to lose that operative. So first things first, stick to heavy cover turning point 1, use the conceal order, and consider where you're placing operatives in light cover. Are you avoiding that line of sight to vantage points or not, to make sure that you're not getting too punished. The next point that I think will probably help is model spacing. So this is probably one of the best uses for, rather than a tape measure, the actual kill team tool for the white circle, because that's usually the blast size that you need to consider. But it is worth double checking with your opponents as soon as you get to a table, asking the question, do you have any long range blast? Do you have any long range indirect? What size of blast do you have? Because there's going to be nothing worse than getting caught out by an Illusidian Starstriders player with a long range 3-inch blast if you've spaced everyone out perfectly 2 inches. So ask those questions and understand, and then make sure that you use your model spacing correctly to avoid those big multi-kill threats, because that's really what's going to get you punished heavily. But usually, when you get to the sort of medium experienced guys, they've got their deployment locked down. They already know how to use conceal. They already know how to stick to heavy cover. And then it's during their first turn movements where they start making the mistakes. So they'll start moving guys up the board, and you get this you have this feeling of, I really want to make ground. I really want to keep pushing guys up. I want to get as much presence up the board as I can. But in doing so, that's when they start to make those mistakes. And I think a common thing is it can feel wrong to pass with the model. People go, I really don't want to just flip this guy over and say that he's activated without doing anything. But sometimes that's actually the best thing you can do with the model, because by moving them up, and they might be the model that joins the line of 3 to make the perfect blast target, you end up putting yourself in a worse position. So I think holding those guys back is really good, and unless it's going to gain you something, don't just randomly throw models into the mid board where they could be exposed to threats. Is what I would think in that. Now I think the other tips that I've got on this same thing is placement of engaged operatives and measuring threat distances correctly. So I'll start with the placement of engaged operatives. You almost always have to have some sort of credible threats to keep your opponent honest. So if you don't have any credible threats, so let's say you've got all your guys on conceal and you choose fortify turn 1 and you have no method of changing it, no silent weapons or anything like that, well, your opponent knows that they can do really whatever the hell they want, and there's no penalty to them, right? They can throw a grenadier right into the mid board, as close as they can to your guys, and throw a grenade at you, and maybe win initiative and throw a second grenade or whatever it is, and there's no risk to them for doing that. So you always have to have some threats. Now, some teams like Wormblade, all their models are threats because they can all flip, whatever. But a lot of teams they're not, and usually I always go back to Pathfinders because they're such a great team to explain it with. But you have those 2 weapon experts with their rail rifles or with their iron rifles, and you want to keep those guys on engage, but not have them in a position where they're going to kill all your friends nearby who are on conceal. So the only really 100% safe way, I think, of achieving that against most opponents is using visibility blocking terrain, or using obscurity to your advantage. And I think it's that understanding of how line of sight works, measuring those threat angles, checking with that laser line, making sure that, okay, if I position this guy 2 inches away from this cover here, the furthest that they can come to is all the way over here to the left, and all the way over there to the right, and I know that either it's not achievable for them to make that in a single move and shoot, or if you're playing against elites, whatever, can they move dash to that point? But if in doing so, are they throwing a model into the open where you can then potentially penalise them with your other threat model later on? That kind of thing is what I think about. So you have to have some threats on the board to keep your opponent honest, but make sure you use either visibility blocking or obscurity to keep those threats safe. And if you can't do that, they have to be away from everyone else if your opponent's got a long range blast. You can't be keeping them in amongst all your concealed operatives that you need to keep safe. So that's that. And then finally, obviously, it's measuring correct threat distances. This is something that I see people get wrong quite a lot, but actually is a really good fix, or a really good tool to use in almost every single game. So you can measure out with I like to use a tape measure because I think it's the easiest way of getting the distances that you need, exactly how far someone can move. So in my head, I think to myself, all right, they're going to deploy 3 inches in, they're going to get a 3-inch scouting phase dash potentially, they're going to move 6 inches on top of that, and then they're going to throw their grenade a further 6. And you go, okay, that is a 18-inch threat range, and that's what I need to plan for. Nice. But then you could also look at it as, well, what if they had a comms guy that gave him a +1 APL? Do they have that ability on their team? They do. Actually, I need to add an additional 3 inches for that move dash and then grenade throw. And by looking at those sorts of numbers, you can then start to realistically plan how far can this guy get, what ranges do they actually threaten me at, and really take it into full consideration. And I think there's a bunch of other things that have similar abilities. Some models can ignore the transverse penalty to be able to get further than you might expect them to. Some models might be able to do the free dashes down the side of the board in conjunction with a scouting phase dash, potentially. Taking that sort of stuff in and using all that knowledge to go, okay, I know that the maximum threat distance that this model can do this turn is X, and then make sure that you position accordingly based on that knowledge. And I think it's something, to be honest, you should really be asking your opponent about as you go through. And you can talk to them. And I regularly sort of have that conversation where I'll go, okay, this guy can move X and he can dash right and he can throw X, wherever it is. Do you have any APL modification on your team? Oh, I do actually, as a comms. All right, whereabouts is your comms? Is he in range of your guy to give him that buff this turn? No, he's not actually. He's too far away. Okay, I can now reduce that threat range that I'm worried about. Oh, he's actually behind a barricade. Is there a way that you have to ignore the penalties for that? Maybe it's a Wormblade guy, and they go, yeah, I can spend a CP and I can ignore that. Or maybe they say, no, I can't. You go, all right, so to get round the barricade, it's going to cost you 2 inches, say, and therefore I can reduce your threat range by that again. And you can, but by doing those sort of smart questions, you can find out what you need to account for throughout the whole of it. And I think, I was going to say, to wrap all that up, there's a lot to cover off. So maybe just make a checklist, right? And just go, these are the smart questions that I think I should be asking, and just go through, and at the start of each turning point, just run through your little list of considerations and go, have I accounted for a pre-game dash? Have I accounted for a scouting phase dash, a change of order, whatever it is? And then if you have that sort of that process, once you've done it a few times, it becomes muscle memory, and then you're good to go from there.
I'm reminded by something that you said to me once, actually, where you said, when I win, I want it to be because I've played my best game and it's been better than my opponent's game, and not because I've tricked to deceive them. And I think that's actually echoed throughout the Kill Team community, because I can't think of a single game where I've asked a question and the opponent's not been helpful or not done it. I'll be like, oh, have you got any blast weapons on your side, or have you got like a medic ability? And they've always been really forthcoming with that information. So what you do with that information is up to you, but there's no shame in asking that question. It's a complex game. You can't be expected to know all the details. We're not all superheroes.
Yeah, and particularly when it comes to new teams as well. So I took Breaches to a tournament a couple of weeks ago, and obviously I'm new with the team, but for a lot of the guys, it's the first time ever playing against Breaches. And it would have been so easy to, particularly with the cat, get them with a gotcha and just say, let them do their moves and then wheel out the cat, make someone go and engage and shoot with a plasma gun that they didn't see coming. But I always try to explain to them that I've turned up, and we're talking through kill team selection. This is the cat. This is what he does. This is the ranges that you're looking at, and these are the bubbles in which it operates. So there's counters to that, obviously. I'm not going to there and then at the tournament explain to you how to defeat my models, but I'm going to make you be aware of what it does and how it works, so you're not then caught out in a gotcha situation, as people always say, and potentially get tilted going forwards. I think I sort of answered the first half of that question, and I think we're probably going to go into talking about tilt, unless there's anything else you want to cover on that bit, Connor.
No, let's do it. Let's talk about tilt.
So tilt's a really interesting one, because it's something that can be really hard based on your personality to deal with. Some people are just naturally cool. Like, I think Mark's probably a good example of someone that I think just seems to be a naturally cool-headed kind of guy. Doesn't worry too much. I kind of get like maybe a tournament tilt. So if I know that I'm not going to win, my sort of care goes down slightly, which is something I need to work on, which then means I can have like a spiral effect potentially, and I play worse and worse as the games go on. And it's something that can be really difficult to avoid. But there's been recently, I've seen it most commonly in like some of the elite teams, is I've gone into games, we played them at home, you and I, where I've been 2 models down, or let's say you've been 2 or 3 models down, and
half the elite.
half the elite team. You lost half your models in a single turning point, and usually it was your bloody aspiring champion with his power fist and plasma pistol. He's gone in, he's charged a guy, he's killed him, he shot someone else, and I'm thinking to myself, in a single activation, I've just lost 2 guys. I'm out of it, and it will obviously be my most important models. It will be my plasma pistol, my doom bolt, or something like that. And I think to myself, oh god, there's absolutely no way that I can recover in this situation. But we just sort of have that conversation. We go, well, you know what? Let's just play it out, because you never know what the dice are going to do. And that's obviously great advice from someone there saying, just play it out. But remind yourself, it's just a game, Let's see what happens, and go on. Because I've seen so many people that have said, I want to concede now, and then potentially come on to have a really close game. So you never know the way the dice are going to go. You never know what the next turning point holds. And in one of those games, I remember I was 2 models down for one of those plays, but then I managed to just about crawl it back, and at the end I think I won by a couple of points, but I was ready to concede and re-rack at that point and go, you know what, there's no point playing on, because it's a done deal. So really don't give up on it, because you 100% lose every game that you concede, no doubt. And if you're at a tournament, you can think, all right, even if I do lose this, how can I then maximize the amount of VP that I'm getting, right? How can I get those tac ops, and how can I try and get a bit more out of this game, so that I'm in better stead for the next round, and make sure I don't lose too much on the rankings. And then finally, my advice would be, just during that course of the game, if you think you've lost, just change your win condition. So in your head, you can start off the day saying, the win condition is I'm going to come first, and that's all I'm going to do. Or your win condition can be, I'm going to max my tac ops, whatever it's going to be. Maybe you have absolutely shocking dice, and you go, there is nothing to do about this. My dice have been terrible. I'm out of it. Well, just go then and go, okay, well, my new win condition from this is, can I score another 5 VP? And if I do, then it's my Pyrrhic victory. I've managed to just about achieve the thing that I was trying to set out. And maybe you lose the game overall, but maybe you gain your own internal victory and say, even with that awful dice, I managed to get it to this close, or I'm going to play for the draw, and I'm going to try and make that point score as close as possible to give my opponent a really good game. So it's that kind of having a psychological shift in your head as to how you're playing it, and go, right, I'm going to change my own personal win condition. I'm going to see if I can then win by not winning the game, but in my own way. I think that's probably how I would try and avoid tilt.
I was thinking about it then. There's an interesting other side to this that we haven't really touched on. So where most people get triggered, say we'll go back to that game we had where you lost those models and it looked like a done deal. I also thought it looked like a done deal, and I got complacent, and I started taking unnecessary risks. I started leaving people out that I shouldn't have left out, and you just kept playing normally, kept playing tidy, tried to focus on the objectives, and suddenly that lead that I'd edged in the beginning was slowly chipped away, and now it's a game again. So don't ever lose your cool. The opponent can still make mistakes down the line, and the dice are leaving out.
And that's probably a great point for the reverse side of the coin, right? Is you've started off and you've rolled an absolute blinder. You've got your Vet Guard sniper, you've rolled 4 6s, and you've killed an incest at turn 1, and you think to yourself, oh my god, I've got this game in the absolute bag, and you stop paying attention, and then suddenly, it all goes wrong. You've got to play the game out. You've got to take it seriously from start to finish, and you've got to keep thinking about where you are during the game, and you've got to keep playing for points. The game is all about points, and it's not about killing people. It's not about how many models you lose. It's about points. And I think that's the thing. Is okay, well, maybe they have killed loads of guys, but by doing this and this and this, I can get these points back. And if I'm up on points, I win, and that's really what matters. So I love that sort of that flip on the coin there, looking for the other side as well. Don't rest on your laurels as soon as you're in a good place, because it can go wrong in a flash. And I think particularly with elite teams, because they're so explosive on their damage. It comes out of nowhere, and it's huge.
Great question.
Do you think we've covered all that off?
Yeah, I think that was a great question.
Sweet. Well, if we haven't, and you have any more questions that you think you want to hit back at us in the comments, make sure to get them in there, and we'll try and get around to it. But hopefully that's given you a bit to think on, and to hopefully maybe implement your next games. I think the last thing for us to do, Conor, is to go into our tactical tip of the day, I think. Unless you have anything else?
No, let's do it.
Okay, so tactical tip of the day is going to be the quote that I've made for myself. Sure, someone else probably said it first, but I'm stealing it now. Is dice don't kill people, dice with rerolls do. And I've said this to people over and over again, right? Is it's so important to think about where you're getting rerolls, and it's going to massively increase your reliability and massively increase your probability to kill. And we saw it when Phobos came out. They're a team that have no rerolls, like built into their team, apart from the veteran and his ability for ammo. But apart from that, the rest of the team they don't have rerolls. And sometimes they're rolling and they're doing great. And I remember playing against the Pathfinders, and I had one game and I thought, oh man, Phobos, they're so strong. You know, they're really, really good. I'm killing everything. I'm doing so well. This has worked out perfectly for me. Next game, terrible dice, loads of 1s and 2s, no ability to re-roll them apart from CP re-rolls or potentially the purity seals. And I was like, oh my god, I can't play with this team. You know, I've gone from a massive high of getting all crits to a massive low of getting all misses. But the way that you can mitigate that is re-roll. So the reason why Phobos are bad, in my opinion, isn't their lack of AP. Like they can get AP or they can get crits and force through damage. It's their lack of re-rolls. And that's why Intercession beat them every day of the week, because they have such easy access to re-rolls through the Tactical Doctrine, and it makes a huge difference in their playstyle. And obviously you've played a lot of Pathfinders, Conor, so you're used to having a lot of re-rolls, right?
Yeah, so I noticed early on the impact that just even having the one marker light on made to my game. I wasn't really thinking about the math at the time. I was just something I sort of noticed. And then when you actually like look through the data and start seeing what the impact of these extra dice rerolls, because they can get it not just from the marker lights, they can also get it from bonded as well. You can suddenly get incredibly reliable shooting laid down on the opponent. Do we have the stats somewhere?
Yeah, so there's a software that I use called Kill Team Calculator, and I'll put it in the description. It's a guy on Discord that's made it, and hopefully we'll get him on for an episode at some point, because it's, I think, revolutionised the way that I look at stats and interact with them and use percentages, and it's really, really good. But here's some base stats so people can see the effect. So let's say you have a regular Shazla shooting at you with a pulse carbine, and he's shooting at a regular guardsman. With no rerolls, it's a 37% chance that he kills, which is actually pretty low in the terms of, you know, the game and how it works. 37% is not a good chance that you're going to kill that guy. So that's no rerolls. Suddenly you apply a marker light, which gives you the ability to reroll one of your dice, and suddenly that shoots to 52%. So now more often than not, the guardsman is going to die. And you think to yourself, wow, that's, you know, I'm now significantly more happy with that percentage. You add the marker light and the bonded, so now you have 2 rerolls, and you're at 63%. And that's a huge jump. And I think people, it's hard to sort of explain, but an 11% jump in probability is a big jump. And then once you get to the dizzying heights of 3 marker lights, which is ignoring cover, +1 ballistic skill, and those 2 rerolls, you're looking at 80% chance to kill, which is just phenomenal. Like, so from 37% to 80% chance is a huge change in your probability of kill. So you have to consider those rerolls and how you're going to have them in your list, where they're coming from, and how you're going to use them. Because if you don't, you're going to get diced out. And it's why I had issues with Corsairs when playing them, and it's why I have issues playing Phobos with them as well, because maybe not during your first game of a tournament series, maybe not during your second game, but during one of those 4, you're going to have a game where you just roll terribly. And unless you can re-roll those dice, then it's not going to work out for you. So that's my tactical for the day. Dice don't kill people, dice with re-rolls do. Don't forget about the re-rolls and how you're going to build them into your list, or how you're going to use them in your kill team. Okay, I think that's everything for today's episode. So hopefully you found something new or useful while listening. If you did, throwing us a like would be greatly appreciated. And if you want to make sure you don't miss any episodes, make sure you subscribe so you get a notification as soon as the next one drops. And if you can't wait and you want early access, we do have a Patreon where you'll get exclusive access to all content ahead of time. But as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback. So drop a comment and we'll get right to you. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Ryan. This has been Turning Point Tactics, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.